The Admiral's son had been lying in a VA hospital bed for 4 months, diagnosed as vegetative after a training accident during Bud S. The doctors had already stopped looking for answers. The paperwork was almost done. Dana was the new nurse on that floor, quiet, overlooked, humiliated every week by Dr. Harwell, a burned-out neurologist who signed diagnosis reports without finishing the exam, who cut family consultations short, and who treated the Admiral's grief like an inconvenience on his schedule. But Dana noticed things the others had stopped looking for. Subtle shifts in the young man's breathing pattern, micro-contractions that weren't random, a response that wasn't supposed to exist in a vegetative patient. She had seen it once before, in a valley in Afghanistan, in a soldier that every medic on scene had already written off. That man walked out of the field hospital 6 weeks later. When the Admiral arrived demanding answers and Dr. Harwell dismissed him with a folder of signed paperwork. Dana stepped forward, quiet, steady, and said the 3 words that no one in that hallway expected from a nurse. "Sir, I disagree." What she does next will force an entire hospital to reckon with who really gets to decide when someone is gone, and who was never qualified to make that call in the first place. If you've ever been told to stay quiet when you knew something was wrong, drop a comment below and subscribe. Because what Dana uncovers inside that file won't just save one life. It will expose how many others were never truly checked. "He's stable, Doctor," Harwell said without looking up from his clipboard. "Meaning he's not getting worse. That's the best I can offer." The Admiral stood at the foot of the bed with his cover pressed against his chest. His dress uniform was pressed sharp. His face was not. "He moved his hand last Thursday," the Admiral said. "The night nurse reported it, Doctor." Harwell finally looked up, but not at the Admiral. He looked at the wall behind him, the way people look when they have already decided the conversation is over and are simply waiting for the other person to understand that. "Spontaneous motor activity," he said. "It happens with vegetative patients. It means nothing clinically. He's my son. And he's my patient. I understand your grief, Admiral. But we've run every protocol. The diagnosis is consistent. Prolonged vegetative state following severe traumatic brain injury. There is no meaningful brain activity. The kindest thing you can do now is begin considering long-term options." He set the clipboard down on the counter and walked out before the Admiral could respond. The ICU room absorbed the silence the way hospital rooms always did, indifferently, the monitors continuing their quiet work, the ventilator cycling with mechanical patience, the overhead lights staying exactly as bright as they had been a moment ago when a physician was still pretending to care. Dana had been standing near the door the entire time, adjusting the IV line on the monitor cart, pretending to document something on the tablet in her hand. She was good at pretending. She had spent years building that particular skill. She watched the Admiral stand there after Harwell left. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just stared at his son like a man who had survived every battlefield the Navy had ever sent him to, only to find himself losing to a clipboard in a fluorescent-lit room on American soil. She knew that look. She had worn it once herself, in a different context, in a different country. But the shape of it was the same. The look of a person who has run out of official options and is standing at the edge of something they cannot cross alone. Dana set the tablet down and checked the monitor readings the way she had been checking them every hour for 11 days. Respiratory rate 11, heart rate 54, oxygen saturation 97, blood pressure 110/68. All of it technically within range for a vegetative patient. All of it technically fine. She did not think it was fine. She had been thinking that for 11 days, and she had learned not to say it out loud. Not here. Not to Harwell. The last time she had flagged something unusual in a chart, he had called her diligent in a tone that made the words sound like an accusation and reassigned her to intake for a week. Dana moved to the bedside and checked the positioning of the young man's arm the way her job required. 23 years old, Petty Officer 3rd Class Kyle Merritt. He had been 8 weeks into Bud S, basic underwater demolition and SEAL training when the accident happened, a diving evolution gone wrong. Anoxic brain injury following submersion. He had been pulled out of the water. He had been resuscitated on the dock. He had never come back, at least not the way anyone expected, or the way anyone here seemed willing to look for. She smoothed the blanket near his shoulder and let herself look at his face for a moment longer than the task required. He had dark circles under his eyes the way long-term patients often did. His cheeks were slightly sunken. His lips were dry despite the moisture protocol. None of that was unusual. What was unusual was the faint tension around his jaw that she had first noticed 11 days ago, on her third shift on the floor. During a routine vitals check at 0200 when the hallway was empty and no one was watching. Not a reflex, not a spasm. Something more deliberate than either of those. Something effortful, the way a thing is effortful when it is being done against resistance. She had documented it. Twice. Harwell had noted artifact both times in the chart without once walking into the room to look at the patient himself. The Admiral finally turned from the bed and looked at her. He had probably registered her before the way people registered furniture, as part of the room's inventory, rather than as a person in it. "How long have you been on this floor?" he asked. 6 weeks, she said. He nodded once, the way officers nod when they are calculating something and don't want you to know they're calculating it. "You were here Thursday night?" "No, sir. I read the report." He looked back at his son. The night nurse said his fingers moved toward her hand. "Not randomly, like he was reaching." "I read that too," Dana said carefully. He studied her face for a moment. The Admiral had the eyes of someone who had spent a career reading people faster than they could manage themselves. "You have something to say." She ran the risk calculation. It was the kind of calculation she had stopped needing to think through consciously. The variables had become automatic. What is the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent? And what is the stake on the table? And who carries that stake? Kyle Merritt carried it. That was the answer. He always had been the answer. For 11 days. "I've noticed some things in his readings," she said. "Patterns I'd like to document more formally before I say anything specific." The Admiral's jaw tightened slightly. "Dr. Harwell has been very specific." "I know. He's told me 4 times that my son is not there anymore." "I know that too." A long silence settled between them. The ventilator cycled. Somewhere down the hall, a cart moved over a threshold with a metallic click that echoed briefly and disappeared. "What kind of patterns?" the Admiral asked. "The kind I'd want a second neurologist to look at," she said. "That's all I can say right now." The Admiral looked at her for a long moment. His eyes held the particular exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from holding weight upright for too long, from refusing to let something fall even when every official voice in the room is telling you to open your hands and let it go. "I've requested a consult twice," he said. Harwell denied both requests. Dana absorbed that. A department head denying a family's request for a second opinion on a vegetative patient was not standard practice. It was the kind of decision that made sense only when the person making it had a specific investment in a specific outcome. And that thought had been sitting at the edge of her attention since she first pulled up the original intake documentation 2 weeks ago. The Admiral put his cover back on his head with the same precise economy he probably applied to everything, and walked to the side of the bed. He stood very close to his son but did not touch him. Like a man who had been told too many times that the person in front of him was already gone and was afraid that reaching out might prove it. "Kyle," he said quietly. "I'm here." Nothing happened. The monitors held steady, the ventilator cycled, and then Dana saw it, just for a second. So brief that anyone at the wrong angle or looking at the wrong part of the room would have missed it entirely. The faint crease between Kyle Merritt's eyebrows deepened. Not a spasm. Not the random motor artifact of a body running its basic maintenance routines. Something different in quality. Something that had the character of effort rather than reflex. The particular expression a face makes when the person behind it is trying very hard to do something the body no longer remembers how to do. She did not say anything. She noted the time on the tablet. 13:47 hours. She noted the stimulus. Paternal voice. Close proximity. Direct address by first name. She noted the response. Bilateral corrugator activation. Approximately 1.5 seconds duration. Resolved spontaneously. She flagged it for the attending. She already knew what Harwell would write. She documented it anyway, because documentation was the only currency available to her right now, and she intended to spend every coin. The Admiral stayed at the bedside for another 20 minutes, talking quietly to his son about things Dana could not hear clearly and made no effort to overhear. When he finally left, he paused at the door and looked back at her. He did not say anything, neither did she, but something had shifted in the room. Some transaction of understanding that required no words and would have been diminished by them. After the Admiral left, Dana finished her rounds and ended up at the nursing station with a cup of coffee that had been sitting long enough to be useless. She drank it standing, the way she always drank it, facing the hallway, back never entirely to the door. Old habit, the kind that had become structural rather than conscious. Carol, the charge nurse, dropped a stack of updated discharge folders on the counter and looked at Dana over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that carried information she was deciding whether to deliver directly or sideways. She chose sideways. Harwell wants the merit chart updated before end of shift, Carol said. He's meeting with the family liaison tomorrow morning. What kind of meeting? Carol gave her the look, the one that meant she already knew the answer and didn't want to be the one to put words around it. The paperwork kind, Carol said. Dana looked at her coffee. She thought about the corrugator activation she had just documented. She thought about the breathing pattern variations she had been logging for 11 days. She thought about a valley in Kunar province and the way the mind recognized the shape of a problem even years later, even in different countries, even in different lives. What time is the meeting? Dana asked. 9 a.m. She nodded once, set the coffee down, walked back toward room 14. She was going to need documentation that Harwell could not dismiss as artifact. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and pushed open the door. Kyle Merritt lay still and pale under the fluorescent light, the ventilator working steadily, the monitors reading everything they were designed to read and missing everything they weren't designed to look for. Dana stood at the bedside for a moment and looked at him without touching anything. The clinical part of her mind ran its assessments automatically, the way it always did. Color, positioning, respiratory effort, skin condition. All of it consistent with prolonged bed rest. All of it consistent with the diagnosis in the chart. Then she placed 2 fingers very carefully behind his ear. Not a nursing school technique. Not something from any civilian clinical manual she had ever read. Something learned in a field clinic with no imaging equipment and no time and lives measured in minutes rather than prognoses, from a surgeon who had spent 15 years working in conditions where the standard protocol was simply not available and improvisation was not optional. He had taught her that the nervous system had pathways that standard reflex testing did not assess, that a person could fail every conventional neurological examination and still register stimulus through pathways that most Western clinical practice never thought to test. She pressed. She watched the monitor. The respiratory rate shifted. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Just a single cycle that ran slightly longer than the baseline average. A fraction of a second of something that was not quite a pause and not quite a breath and not quite nothing, like a body that had been holding something very carefully and briefly forgot to keep holding it. She released the pressure, counted 3 seconds, pressed again, same spot, same pressure. 2 fingertips, the heel of her palm resting lightly against the pillow. The respiratory rate shifted again, same pattern, same quality. Dana took her hand back and stood very still. She had seen this twice now in controlled conditions. She had seen a version of it once before in a different country, with different equipment and significantly higher stakes in the immediate moment. The difference between a machine reacting to interference and a body reacting to stimulus was not always visible in the numbers, but it was present in the quality of the response, in the way it reproduced consistently and resolved cleanly and arrived with the timing of something intentional rather than random. This was not artifact. She documented the response. Time, stimulus, observed output, duration, return to baseline. Then she walked to the nursing station terminal and pulled up the original intake documentation. She had read it twice before. She read it again now, slower, the way she had once read mission intelligence packages in a forward operating base in Honduras, looking for the point where the record stopped matching the underlying reality. The initial neurological assessment had been completed 48 hours post-injury. Standard protocol. Glasgow Coma Scale scoring, brainstem reflex testing, apnea protocol, all documented as consistent with no meaningful brain activity. The confirmatory assessment, required for vegetative state diagnosis, had been completed 5 days later. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the attending physician signature. She looked at the nursing floor log for that day. Then she pulled up the medication administration record and sat back in the chair. The sedation given 6 hours before the confirmatory assessment was propofol, 40 milligrams, documented as routine comfort care. Kyle's chart showed he had been agitated the previous evening. The order had come from a covering physician, not Harwell. That part was not unusual. Sedation in distressed patients was standard. What was not standard was that the covering physician who signed the sedation order was also listed as second attending on the confirmatory assessment that followed 6 hours later. The same person had ordered the sedation and then participated in the evaluation that the sedation would have suppressed. High-dose propofol, given 6 hours before neurological reflex testing, would blunt or eliminate exactly the responses that testing was designed to find. Any physician who understood sedation pharmacology would know that. Any physician who did not would have no business participating in a confirmatory brain death assessment. Dana was not a neurologist. She was not a pharmacologist. She was not making a formal accusation, not even in the privacy of her own thinking. She was simply reading the timeline in sequence and noting that it told a story that was different from the story in the diagnosis. She printed the medication administration record. She printed the nursing floor log. She folded both and tucked them into her scrub pocket. The clock on the wall read 0214, less than 7 hours before the meeting. She needed something she could demonstrate in real time, in front of a witness with enough institutional standing to make Harwell's pre-categorization strategy untenable. She needed it before 9 a.m., not through the formal review channel that Harwell had cited with such deliberate precision, because 6 weeks was not an accident of bureaucracy. 6 weeks was a calculation. Carol appeared at the end of the station. Harwell wants to see you. He's in the consult room. He saw you in 14. Dana thought about what that meant, about the fact that Harwell had been watching, that he had seen her at the bedside and chosen to pull her into a room rather than flag the monitoring system, which was what a physician would do if the concern were genuinely clinical rather than strategic. He already knew what she was looking for. He wanted to get ahead of it. She walked to the consult room. Harwell was at the small table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a coffee mug that had been refilled enough times that the contents bore no resemblance to what they had started as. He was a man in his late 50s who had the look of someone who had once been a careful physician and had spent enough years in an understaffed VA unit that the careful physician was now inaccessible even to him. He looked at Dana without warmth. "Close the door," he said. She did. "The Merritt case is closed diagnostically," he said. "The family is grieving and looking for reasons to believe otherwise. That is a completely understandable human response. It is not a clinical finding. I documented a respiratory rate variation in response to targeted stimulus," Dana said. "Twice, in controlled conditions, which I will note in the chart as a monitoring artifact consistent with his diagnosis. I also have questions about the medication administration timing before the confirmatory assessment." The room went quiet in a different way than rooms went quiet when someone said something surprising. This was the quiet of a room where something expected had finally arrived. Harwell took his glasses off his forehead and set them on the table. Something had changed in his expression. The burned-out fatigue replaced by something colder and more considered. "Be very careful," he said, "about what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Dana said. "I'm asking a clinical question about protocol timing. You are a floor nurse with 6 weeks on this unit questioning a diagnosis confirmed by 3 attending physicians and a department chief." "Yes," she said, "I am." He stood up. He was significantly taller than her and used the height not aggressively but architecturally, as a passive reminder of structural reality. "The family meeting is at 9 tomorrow. The discussion will focus on transitioning to palliative comfort protocol. I suggest you spend your remaining shift hours on your other patients and allow this case to proceed as documented." He picked up his mug and moved toward the door. "If you have documentation concerns," he said without turning around, "the formal channel accepts submissions on a rolling basis. Review takes approximately 6 weeks. He left. Dana stood in the empty room and looked at the table where he had been sitting. The specific architecture of what had just happened was clear enough. He was not trying to change her mind. He was timing her out. 6 weeks was past the point where a floor nurse's documentation could disrupt a meeting that was going to happen in less than 7 hours. She walked back to room 14. She did not sleep during her break. She sat in the small staff lounge with the printed records spread on the table and worked through the timeline the way she had once worked through mission intelligence, not trying to force it into a shape, but letting the sequence of events arrange itself, letting the gaps appear where they were rather than where she was looking. The same physician who ordered the propofol had signed the confirmatory assessment. That conflict of interest existed regardless of intent. It existed in the documentation. It could be demonstrated with timestamps, but demonstrating it through official channels would take 6 weeks. What she needed was something that existed in real time, in the room, observable by a witness whose professional standing was sufficient to make dismissal operationally difficult. She had 2 documented respiratory responses to targeted stimulus that Harwell had pre-categorized as artifact. She had an 11-day nursing log of micro-responses that existed only in her own chart entries, which Harwell could access and contextualize before the morning meeting if he chose to. She had a technique that could not be dismissed as artifact by any neurologist who understood what they were looking at. The problem was that it had no official standing in any American clinical manual and no name that appeared in any protocol she had ever seen cited in a hospital setting. She had used it 3 times in the field. All 3 patients had survived. She thought about Sergeant First Class Marco Delgado. October, Kunar Province, the 3rd week. A Special Forces A-team had come back from a direct action mission with 2 killed in action and 1 unresponsive blast overpressure injury, no visible external trauma, GCS of 3. He had been in the back of the vehicle, breathing, but the kind of breathing that machinery produces rather than the kind that intention produces. The team's senior medic had run the field protocol twice. Same answer both times. He's gone. Breathing because of reflex. Nothing else is in there. Dana had been 27 years old, 8 months into her deployment as the unit's 18 Delta Special Forces medical sergeant. She had crouched beside Delgado in the back of that vehicle with a headlamp and 2 fingers and something she had learned from a Colombian Special Forces surgeon named Dr. Reyes during her first rotation, a way of assessing for concealed brainstem activity through a nerve pathway that conventional protocol did not test for. Dr. Reyes had developed it over 15 years working in environments where standard imaging was unavailable, and the choice between stopping and continuing was made in seconds rather than after consultation. She had pressed 2 fingers behind Delgado's ear in the dark and watched a monitor that should not have responded respond. She had not let it go after that. Delgado had been at his daughter's quinceañera 14 months later. Dana had not been there because nobody in that room knew what she had done, and she had told herself that the outcome was the point, and the anonymity was acceptable. She'd believed that for a long time. She looked at the clock on the wall, 3:01. She looked at the Admiral's card. He had given her his direct line the previous week when she had asked a specific question about Kyle's pre-incident training record. the kind of exchange that ended with a card passed quietly across a counter. The officer's version of leaving a back channel open without saying so explicitly. She picked up the card and held it. Using it meant stepping out of her lane in a way that had institutional consequences. It meant demonstrating a technique that had no clinical standing. It meant every defense she had constructed between her current life and her previous one becoming temporarily unavailable in a room with a Navy admiral and a hospital administration that was already managing exposure. She looked at Kyle Merritt's face on the other side of the window, at the faint tension around his jaw that had been there for 11 days, at the evidence of a person doing the hardest possible work in the most invisible possible way, working against absence with nothing but whatever was left of intention after a traumatic brain injury had taken everything else. She picked up her phone. The Admiral answered on the second ring. His voice was fully awake, which told her he had not been sleeping any more than she had. "This is Dana Mercer," she said. "I'm the nurse in room 14, sir. I need you to come to the hospital tonight. I need you to see something before that meeting tomorrow morning." A pause. Then, "How soon?" "As soon as you can get here. And, sir, I need you to trust me for approximately 40 minutes before I explain everything. Can you do that?" The pause this time was shorter. "I'll be there in 20, he said. The Admiral arrived in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, no rank visible. But he moved the way he always moved, with the particular economy of someone who had never fully stopped scanning a room for threat vectors, regardless of what he was wearing. The 2 MPs he brought with him stayed in the hallway without being asked, which told Dana they had worked with him long enough to know when he wanted civilian cover. She met him at the door to room 14. "Before I show you anything," she said, keeping her voice down, "I need to tell you something that will be difficult to hear." He looked at her steadily, the particular focus of a man who had been receiving difficult information for his entire professional life and had learned to take it straight. "Go ahead." The confirmatory assessment that established Kyle's diagnosis may have been conducted while he was under a level of sedation that would have suppressed the responses being tested. The physician who ordered that sedation also participated in the assessment 6 hours later. The Admiral was completely still. "I'm not making a formal accusation," Dana said. "I'm telling you what I found when I read the medication administration record and the assessment timeline side by side. The conflict of interest is documented. What it means is a separate question. Why tell me this first, before whatever you called me here to see? Because if I show you the responses first, you'll want to believe them regardless of whether they're real," she said. "I need you to come in with no hope yet. I need pure observation. Can you do that?" He looked at her the way commanding officers look at subordinates who have just presented an unexpected brief. Not dismissive, not yet fully accepting. Simply recalibrating their model of the situation with new information. "All right." They went in. Dana positioned the Admiral at the left side of the bed, close enough that Kyle would be within voice range, far enough that she could see both the patient's face and the monitor clearly from where she stood. "Don't touch him yet," she said. "Don't speak yet. Just stand there for 30 seconds. The Admiral stood. The monitors held baseline. Dana watched the respiratory waveform scroll. 30 seconds passed. The Admiral's proximity alone produced no response, which was expected. Presence without direct stimulus was not the same as voice recognition. The pathways were different. "Now say his name," she said. "Exactly the way you said it earlier today." The Admiral looked at his son. "Kyle," he said. The respiratory rate shifted on the 4th cycle. Not dramatically, not enough to alarm, but present in the trace, a slightly extended cycle with a different quality than the surrounding pattern. Dana had documented this precise response 3 times across 3 separate sessions. She knew what it looked like, and she knew it was reproducible. The Admiral's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Again," Dana said. "Kyle." The shift returned. The Admiral's eyes moved from the monitor to his son's face, and then back to the monitor. "I'm going to apply a stimulus now," Dana said. "I want you to watch his face, not the monitor. His face." She placed 2 fingers behind Kyle's ear and pressed. The cardiac response came clean and fast, brief and unmistakable, the signature of a nervous system that had processed incoming information and redirected resources in response to it. The Admiral watched his son's face. The crease appeared between Kyle Merritt's brows, the faint bilateral corrugator activation that Dana had been logging for 11 days. The expression a person makes when they are concentrating very hard on something the body barely remembers how to do. Dana released the pressure. "Now speak to him," she said. "Tell him you're here." The Admiral leaned forward, and his voice when it came out was different from the voice he used when he was addressing a room or a situation. Something underneath the command register. Something that existed in a register that only came out when a person was talking to someone they were not willing to lose. "Kyle," he said. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." The monitor moved again. Not the cardiac response this time. The respiratory rate and cardiac trace shifted simultaneously, a coupled response that indicated the 2 systems were processing the same stimulus together, which was what integrated neural activity looked like and what isolated reflex responses did not produce, because reflex responses were exactly that, isolated, one pathway, not 2 systems coordinating. The Admiral straightened. His eyes were very bright. Dana held up one hand, palm out. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Stay clinical for a few more minutes, can you?" He exhaled through his nose with the controlled precision of a man who had spent decades making himself delay what he most wanted to do. "Yes. What I just used has no official standing in any civilian protocol," she said. "Harwell will call it unverified and he'll be technically correct. What I need is a second neurologist who will conduct a formal assessment before the meeting at 9, someone whose credentials Harwell cannot dismiss and whose findings will create institutional documentation that the ethics review channel cannot slow down. It's 3 in the morning. I know. Does your network reach into neurology?" He already had his phone in his hand. Dana listened to him speak for 90 seconds and noted the quality of the exchange, the brevity and directness of it, the way the person on the other end asked 2 questions and then simply said yes. Admirals knew people the way weather systems knew coastlines. The network was not a luxury. It was structure. He ended the call. "Dr. Elaine Torrance," he said. "Chief of Neurotrauma at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. She'll be here at 7. Harwell will know something is happening before the meeting starts." "Yes, he will. He'll move to lock the chart and route through administration." The Admiral's voice returned fully to its command register, the stripped vulnerability of a moment ago gone, something harder and more operational beneath it. "This is my son, and I have been very patient with this institution." Dana pressed 2 fingers behind Kyle's ear one final time, lightly, almost a touch rather than a full application of pressure. The respiratory trace shifted. "He knows you're here," she said quietly. "He's been working very hard for a long time." The Admiral looked at his son in silence for a long moment. "How do you know what that looks like?" he asked. It was the same question that had been forming behind his eyes since the moment Dana had stepped toward him in the room and said she disagreed, and she had been deflecting its various preliminary approaches for hours. But it was 0340, and his son was in that bed, and some accounting had to be made. "I learned this technique in a field clinic in Afghanistan," she said. "From a surgeon who worked in conditions where standard imaging was unavailable and the margin for error was measured in minutes. He taught me that the absence of a conventional response is not the same as the absence of a person, that some pathways require specific stimulus to demonstrate activity, and that the pathways not being tested is not evidence that they don't exist." The Admiral held her gaze with the attention of someone who was no longer processing just what he was hearing, but recalibrating who he was hearing it from. "What unit?" She held his gaze in return. 7th Special Forces Group, 18 Delta. The room was quiet for a moment. The monitors ran their traces. The ventilator cycled. "How long?" he asked. 10 years. He looked at her scrubs, at the floor nursing badge. at the ash-blonde hair slightly loose from where she had tucked it back hours ago, at the unremarkable presentation she had spent years assembling. "And now you're here," he said. "And now I'm here," she agreed. He did not ask why. She had worked with enough officers to know that the ones who had seen enough understood that the reasons people left service and built civilian lives around themselves were as individual as the service itself, and that the question could be asked with genuine interest and still land like a violation. "Dana," he said. "Sir, thank you for calling me." She nodded once. "Get some rest before 7 if you can," he said. "I have a feeling we're going to need you at your best." She walked out of room 14 and down the hallway, and she did not think about the choice she had just made, because the choice had been made at 0301 when she dialed, and there was nothing productive in relitigating it. She thought instead about what the next 4 hours required and what she needed to have ready, and how to position herself so that when Dr. Torrance arrived, Dana would be useful rather than a liability. She had made her choice. She was ready for what it cost. Dr. Elaine Torrance arrived at 0648, 61 years old, compact, precise in the way that people are precise when they have been doing difficult work under pressure, long enough that precision is no longer an effort, but a permanent condition. Gray hair and a shortcut that had probably looked exactly the same for 15 years. A leather bag that had clearly been to several countries and showed it. She moved through the VA hallway with the quality of a building that had been informed of her arrival and had chosen not to argue about it. The Admiral met her at the elevator and spoke to her for less than 2 minutes. Dana watched from the nursing station. Whatever he told her produced no visible surprise in Dr. Torrance's expression. She looked across the hallway at Dana once. A brief professional assessment, the kind that took in and catalogued without distributing reaction, and then walked to room 14. Dana followed. Dr. Torrance set her bag on the counter, pulled on gloves, and looked at the monitor for 45 seconds without speaking. She read the waveform, the way experienced clinicians read it, not looking for individual data points, but for pattern, for the texture of a physiological landscape that communicated more in aggregate than in any single measurement. Then she looked at Dana. "Show me what you found," she said. Not to the Admiral, not to the charge nurse visible through the window, to the nurse. Dana moved to the bedside. She placed 2 fingers behind Kyle's ear and pressed. The cardiac spike came on cue, clean and brief. Dr. Torrance leaned in and watched the trace with complete attention. Her expression did not change. "Again," she said. Dana pressed again. Same response, same character, same duration, same return to baseline. Dr. Torrance straightened and looked at the respiratory waveform. "Speak to him," she said to the Admiral. "His name, Kyle." The respiratory rate shifted on the 4th cycle. Dr. Torrance watched it scroll across the screen without comment. Again, Kyle. The shift returned, the same pattern Dana had documented over 11 days in different conditions at different times of day. Dr. Torrance was quiet for a moment. Then she took the chart from the end of the bed and read it with the same quality of attention she had given the monitor. She was not skimming. She was reading, turning pages with deliberate pace, spending extra time on certain sections in a way that communicated she was building a picture rather than confirming one. When she reached the medication administration section, she stopped. She read it a second time. She set the chart down. "Who was the covering physician on the sedation order?" she asked Dana. "Dr. Calloway. He also signed as second attending on the confirmatory assessment 6 hours later." Dr. Torrance looked at the Admiral. "I need the original scan files, not the report. Raw imaging data. Can you authorize outside attending access to the archived imaging system?" "Tell me exactly what you need," he said. "Formal family authorization for independent review of all archived neuroimaging. I can make the request myself, but direct family initiation accelerates the process significantly." He was already on his phone. Dr. Torrance began the assessment. Full brainstem protocol, the complete version that Harwell had described in the chart as having been performed, conducted as though it had not been. She worked without narrating. Some physicians performed examinations for an audience. Dr. Torrance simply conducted them, moving through each component with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times in conditions where time was not a courtesy. Pupillary response, corneal reflex, oculocephalic reflex. At 0721 Harwell arrived. Donna heard him before she saw him, his voice in the hallway carrying the volume of a man who has just learned that the situation he believed he had managed has restructured itself while he was not watching. He pushed the door open and took in the scene with a single rapid assessment. He saw Dr. Torrance at the bedside. He saw Dana near the wall. He saw the Admiral standing at the foot of the bed with his arms at his sides and his expression doing nothing helpful for Harwell's composure. Something crossed Harwell's face that occupied the territory between anger and fear. "What is this?" he said. Dr. Torrance did not look up from her assessment. "Dr. Harwell, I'm conducting an independent neurological evaluation at the family's request. I'll have preliminary findings available for the 9 o'clock meeting. This is my patient. Any outside consult is routed through the department head and through administration. The patient's legal next of kin has the right to request an independent evaluation," Dr. Torrance said. "That right supersedes departmental routing protocol in cases involving disputed diagnosis. You are aware of that provision." Harwell's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Dana. "You called the family in the middle of the night," he said. "You used unvetted procedures on a vegetative patient and sent his father into a panic, and now you have brought an outside physician into my unit without authorization, and I want your badge removed from this room immediately." The Admiral stepped forward. He did not change his volume. He did not alter his posture toward any visible degree of threat. He simply moved so that he was positioned between Harwell and the rest of the room with the particular stillness of a person who has stopped performing non-aggression and is simply being exactly what they are. "Dr. Harwell," he said, "my son is in that bed. A physician I trust is assessing him. You are going to stand in the hallway, and you are going to wait. If you choose otherwise, the next call I make will involve the Inspector General's office and your department chief simultaneously, and this morning will become significantly more complicated for you than it already is." Harwell looked at the Admiral. He looked at Dr. Torrance. He looked at Dana one final time with an expression she had seen before, in different settings, from people who had underestimated a situation and were in the process of calculating the full cost of that. He walked into the hallway. The door closed behind him. "Dr." Torrance continued the assessment without acknowledging the interruption, which told Dana something about the number of times she had conducted examinations under adversarial conditions. At 0743, she found the gag reflex. Faint. It required 2 attempts and positioning closer than standard protocol specified, but it was present, bilateral, and when she tested it a 3rd time, it returned with the same character as the first 2 responses. Consistent. Reproducible. Not artifact. She straightened. She looked at the Admiral. "His brainstem is not dead," she said. The words landed in the room the way certain words land when they rewrite the structure of everything that has preceded them, not loudly, with the weight of fact rather than announcement. The Admiral gripped the bedrail. His knuckles whitened against the metal. "Doctor." Torrance continued without softening because precision was the most useful thing she could offer. "The level of activity I'm finding is significantly reduced. The prognosis for recovery is uncertain, and I will not give you a number this morning because I do not have enough information to give you a responsible one. But the diagnosis of vegetative state as it is documented in this chart is not consistent with what I am observing." "What is consistent?" the Admiral asked. "A state of minimal consciousness at the lower boundary. Possibly a prolonged disorder of consciousness in which identifiable responsiveness was not assessed, because the sedation administered before the confirmatory evaluation would have suppressed exactly the responses that evaluation was designed to find." The Admiral closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then he opened them. The grief was still there, but something else had entered the room. Something that had been outside the door for 4 months and had finally been let in. "What do we do?" he asked. We document everything I have found this morning with full timestamp and methodology. We pull the raw imaging for independent radiological review. And we escalate the medication timeline conflict to the hospital's clinical ethics board, not to administration. Ethics is a separate channel with separate protections, and it cannot be delayed or rerouted by department heads. Dr. Torrance looked briefly at Dana. We also make certain the nurse who initiated this process is protected, because her chart documentation is going to be central to what happens next. Dana absorbed that without visible reaction. She thought about what protection meant in a hospital context, and what it actually covered, and what it did not. She thought about the distance between institutional protection and the reality of being a floor nurse who had called an Admiral at Euro 301 and demonstrated an undocumented technique on a vegetative patient. She had known the exposure when she dialed. She had dialed anyway. "Dr. Torrance," she said. The physician turned. "There's something in the imaging record that may be relevant. The initial scan report describes a diffuse axonal injury pattern consistent with a anoxic event. But according to the incident documentation, Kyle was in the water for 4 minutes and 20 seconds before extraction. The rescue log records water temperature at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Torrance was very still. "At that temperature," Dana continued, "the mammalian dive reflex provides measurable neuroprotection. Cold water submersion triggers a physiological cascade that can preserve brain function for a significantly longer window than warm water submersion. The injury pattern in a patient with active dive reflex response could look substantially different from a standard anoxic presentation on initial imaging. If the scans were read without factoring in the hypothermic protection variable, the injury severity could have been significantly overstated from the first assessment." Dr. Torrance looked at her with an expression that had moved past clinical neutrality into something more focused. "How do you know dive reflex parameters at that temperature range with that level of specificity?" Dana held her gaze. "I've worked in cold water under operational conditions. You learn the physiology because the physiology is the mission." Dr. Torrance held the answer for a moment without accepting or rejecting it. She was the kind of physician who knew when she was receiving partial information and could evaluate the reliability of the source independent of the completeness of the disclosure. "If the scan was read without accounting for hypothermic neuroprotection," she said slowly, working through it, "the injury characterization in the initial report could be fundamentally incorrect, which means the diagnosis was not only procedurally compromised by the sedation conflict, it could have been clinically incorrect from the first imaging interpretation." "That's what I believe," Dana said. Dr. Torrance picked up the chart again. The room was quiet in a way that rooms become quiet when the next moment is carrying significant weight, and everyone present understands it. The ventilator cycled. The monitors ran their traces, and then Kyle Merritt's hand moved. Not a spasm. Not the random motor artifact of a maintenance reflex. His fingers extended slowly. With the particular quality of deliberate effort, the tendons in his wrist visible beneath the skin, his whole arm tracking slightly toward the direction of his father's voice, reaching, doing the thing that bodies do when the person inside them is trying to close a distance that should not exist. The Admiral made a sound that was not a word and took one step forward. Dr. Torrance stepped in beside him and watched the movement for 3 full seconds without speaking. Her expression had not changed, but something in it had sharpened into a different kind of attention. Dana stood near the door and felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, something older and quieter than relief. The particular feeling of a thing that has been true for 11 days finally becoming visible to people with the standing to act on it. She had known it since she first pressed 2 fingers behind his ear in the dark. She had needed this morning for the knowledge to have institutional weight. Dr. Torrance turned from the bed with her jaw set and the look of a physician who has just found evidence of a failure that should not have been possible. "Get me the ethics board contact," she said, "and call administration. The 9 o'clock meeting has a different agenda now." The 9 o'clock meeting did not happen the way Harwell had planned it. It took place in a different room, with different people, and the documents on the table were not the ones he had prepared. By 0814, the VA hospital's clinical ethics officer, Dr. Patricia Wen, had arrived with a legal pad and the expression of someone whose phone had rung at a time that made sleep irrelevant, who had listened to what was said and had come immediately. By 0831, a hospital administrator had appeared with two people in civilian clothes whose specific posture identified them as individuals whose professional function was to be present in rooms before situations became officially documented. By 0847, Harwell had been asked to wait in a separate conference room. He had gone without speaking. The silence was more informative than anything he could have said. Dana was sitting in the hallway outside room 14, on a chair she had pulled from the nursing station. She had been on shift for 11 hours. She was not tired in the way that shift length usually produced tiredness. She was very awake, the particular quality of alertness that certain kinds of sustained focus created. Carol appeared with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had been processing the morning's events and had not yet arrived at the end of that process. She sat in the chair beside Dana and handed her a cup. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere at the far end, a monitor beeped twice and was answered by footsteps. The ethics board meeting continued behind a door 30 feet away. "I saw what you documented," Carol said finally. "Over the last 11 days, all of it." Dana drank the coffee. "I should have looked harder," Carol said. "I've been on this floor for 9 years. I should have looked harder than I did." Dana thought about what that sentence carried. About 9 years of learning to survive in an environment where the path of least institutional resistance ran in a very specific direction. About how Carol was kind and careful and had become fluent in the shape of a system that rewarded not seeing things. And how that fluency was not a character failure, it was an adaptation. "You're looking now," Dana said. Carol turned her cup in her hands. "Who are you?" she asked. Not as an accusation. As a genuine question, the kind asked when the person you thought you knew has demonstrated that you only knew the surface. Dana looked at the closed door of room 14. "Right now I'm the nurse on this floor," she said. "That's the part that mattered this morning." Carol accepted it the way people accept answers that are honest without being complete. At 0923, Dr. Torrance came out of the ethics meeting and walked directly to Dana. "The raw imaging has been pulled for independent radiological review," she said. "The ethics board has opened a formal inquiry into the assessment protocol and the medication administration timeline. The inquiry operates independent of hospital administration, which means it cannot be routed or delayed at the departmental level." Dana nodded. "Harwell?" "Recused from the merit case pending inquiry. He will be less satisfied when the imaging review returns." "What do you think it will show?" Dr. Torrance looked at her steadily. "I think it will show a scan interpreted by someone who had decided what they were going to find before they looked at it," she said. "Which is among the most dangerous errors a physician can make, and among the most difficult to detect from outside the clinical relationship because the documentation looks complete. But it won't be. It won't be." A pause. "The Admiral is waiting to speak with you," Dr. Torrance said. Dana finished the coffee, stood, and walked to room 14. The Admiral had not left since his arrival at 0310. His civilian jacket was folded over the chair in the corner. He looked like a man who had been standing continuous watch for 20 hours and had made no internal negotiation with the possibility of standing down. Kyle's hand rested palm up on the blanket. The Admiral stood beside it without holding it, the way people stand beside something they have been told is irretrievably lost and are not yet certain how to reclassify. Dana stepped to the bedside and checked the monitors. Baseline cardiac rate slightly elevated from overnight. Respiratory pattern more variable than it had been at 0300. The brain doing more work than it had been doing before this morning. The particular kind of variability that indicated a system cycling through its processes rather than sitting at a flat maintenance minimum. She documented it. "His readings are more active than they were last night," she said. "That's meaningful." He nodded once. "I called his mother," he said. "She's on her way." Dana thought about what that phone call had contained, about the architecture of a grief that had been built over 4 months and was now being asked to restructure itself around new information that was not yet certainty but was no longer nothing. There was nothing adequate to say about that. Dr. Torrance said you identified something in the imaging parameters, the Admiral said. The dive reflex consideration. It was a variable the initial read should have accounted for and did not. He looked at her with the direct focus that had characterized every exchange they had had since 0310. You know dive reflex parameters at that temperature range. You know a field assessment technique that isn't in any civilian manual. You served with 7th Group for 10 years. Yes, sir. And you came here. She met his gaze. Yes, sir. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small card, holding it without immediately extending it. The way people hold things while making a final assessment of a decision. Kyle is going to need a long recovery. The road back from where he's been is not linear and it's not short. He's going to need people around him who understand what it means to return from somewhere that should have been a permanent absence. He looked at her. I am building a clinical support team at Portsmouth. Dr. Torrance will lead it. I want you to be part of it. Dana did not answer immediately. She thought about what the offer contained and what it required. About the cover that had served its purpose and was now significantly thinner. About the people who would ask questions that she had built a life around not answering. About the institutional implications of stepping into a military medical environment, carrying a floor nursing badge and a decade of Special Forces service she had never disclosed to her current employer. She also thought about Kyle Merritt's fingers extending toward his father's voice. About the faint crease between his brows that had been there for 11 days, while every official record said there was no one inside to make it. About what it meant to be the only person in a room who could see something true and what it cost to say it, and what it had cost to stay quiet. I'd need to think about it, she said. Take what time you need. He extended the card. She took it. I want you to know something before you do. She waited. What you did last night, calling me, demonstrating what you had found, holding your ground when Harwell told you to stand down was not a small act. You were a floor nurse with no institutional backing, using a technique with no clinical standing, in a context that offered you no protection. You did it anyway because you had read a person correctly when everyone around you had stopped looking. I was doing what needed to be done, she said. Yes, he said. That's what I mean. Dana looked at Kyle, at his hand resting open on the blanket, at the rise and fall of his chest that carried a different meaning than it had carried yesterday. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to the inside of her own wrist, an old field habit, anchoring herself to the present moment through the specific weight of her own pulse. Steady. It was always steady when it mattered most. She put the Admiral's card in her scrub pocket. 3 weeks later, Kyle Merritt opened his eyes, not on a schedule, not during a formal assessment, not as part of any protocol or demonstration. At 0447 on a Tuesday morning, when the hallway was quiet and the overnight nurse was running rounds 2 rooms down, and his mother was asleep in the chair beside his bed, with her head resting on her own folded arms, exhausted by the kind of vigil that doesn't end when visiting hours do. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a while. The ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been. White, acoustic tile, institutional lighting currently at overnight low, the particular texture of a VA hospital room that had absorbed decades of people looking up at it from positions they had not chosen. He looked at it for what might have been a minute, or might have been longer. Then he turned his head. Slowly. The way things move when a person is relearning that movement is available to them, discovering the relationship between intention and result with the careful attention of someone who cannot take that relationship for granted. His mother was 2 feet away, her breathing even with sleep, her hand resting near the edge of the bed rail in the unconscious proximity of someone who had been reaching toward him for 4 months. He could not speak. The speech pathology team had been honest about that from the beginning of his recovery process. That language would return along its own timeline, and that the timeline was not theirs to manage. The brain would find its pathways again. It would do it at the pace of the brain, not the pace of hope or impatience or clinical projection. He did not need to speak. He raised his hand from the blanket slowly, with visible effort, and placed it gently on his mother's arm. She woke up the way people wake when they have been sleeping near an emergency for long enough that awareness is never entirely absent. Her eyes opened. She looked at him. She looked at him and understood in the same instant what she was seeing, and she made a sound that existed below language, something that came from a place that language had never been able to reach anyway, and she put her other hand over his and held it. They stayed like that in the quiet at 0447 on a Tuesday, neither of them speaking, because there was nothing either of them could have said that would have been equal to what was already in the room. Dana was not there when it happened. She heard about it from Carol at the start of the next shift, Carol whose voice had something in it that had not been there before this week, a quality that belonged to people who have witnessed a thing that adjusts their baseline understanding of what is possible and cannot fully put that adjustment away afterward. Dana listened and nodded and went to the staff lounge. She stood at the small window with a cup of coffee in both hands and looked out at the VA parking lot in the early morning. Rows of vehicles belonging to people who came to this building because they had served and because the service had left things in them that required tending. It was a kind of ongoing obligation, the tending. It did not always look the way people expected tending to look. She thought about Portsmouth. She thought about Dr. Torrance's voice in that room at 0743, stating what she had found with the precision and completeness of someone who understood that the fact needed to be stated exactly as it was, without editorial, without softening, because the Admiral deserved the truth without the kindness that would diminish it. She thought about Kyle Merritt's fingers extending toward his father's voice in a room where 4 months of official documentation said there was no one left to reach. She thought about what it meant to have spent years building a life around invisibility and to have discovered in 11 days of chart notations and a phone call at 03001 that the invisibility had never been as complete as she had believed, because the things she knew were not invisible. They had simply been waiting in the space between who she had been and who she was now for the right moment to become necessary. She pulled the Admiral's card from her scrub pocket. She had spent years not wanting to be found. She looked at the card. She thought about Kyle Merritt's hand on his mother's arm at 0447, about his mother's hand over his, about the specific language of that gesture, which required no translation, and had said everything that needed to be said about what it meant to come back from somewhere you were not supposed to come back from. She picked up her phone. It rang twice. "Admiral," she said. "Dana." "I've thought about it." A pause. Then, "And?" She looked out the window at the parking lot and the early morning light moving across it and the rows of vehicles belonging to people who had carried things they were still carrying. "Tell Dr. Torrance I'll be in Portsmouth on Monday," she said. When he answered, his voice had the quality of a man who had learned over a long career to keep relief out of his register and was not fully succeeding. "I'll tell her." Dana ended the call. She put the card back in her pocket. She put on a fresh pair of gloves. She went back to work. The end. If this story hit you somewhere real, subscribe right now. Because every week, there is a new story about someone who was overlooked, underestimated, and quietly carrying something the world never saw. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you have ever stayed quiet when you knew something was wrong, we want to hear it. You are not alone, and neither was Dana.